following program is a peer-to-peer advice show and does not diagnose mental health conditions. If you're seeking social services, please call or text 211 or go to 211.ca. Hello, listeners around the world on radio, streaming, and podcast services. This is It's Not Therapy. I'm Liana and I am not a therapist, but I am your source for navigating the madness of mental health using my top 10 sayings for going good crazy. This episode, we're talking about PTSD in the clergy, specifically military clergy, in the interview with guest U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel Rebecca DeAngelo, who helps and advocates for military chaplains struggling with PTSD they obtained via listening to sometimes thousands of stories of suffering and loss. When many people think of the clergy, okay, we think of the bad ones, right? Either depictions in media of an evil priest that abuses people, or personal stories of abuse, poor, judging, not being there for you when it mattered, or, abuses of power, or other bad forms of abuse. Power corrupts, as the saying goes. Absolute power corrupts absolutely, and there's no more absolute power than God, right? But for many clergy, they see their role as submitting to a calling, not a position of power. They have to serve God, their communities, and their families, but they also have to navigate the structures of their respective religious hierarchies and rules. Church fights, as it's put, are one way that clergy end up traumatized. And that is some tea to spill, but we'll have to leave it for another time. Today, I want to focus on the trauma of the job, not the trauma of toxic politics surrounding the job. While a standard therapist sees somewhere between 10 and 30 clients in a single week, a member of the clergy doesn't have similar time and energy boundaries. Depending on the size of the congregation, they can be responsible for hundreds, if not thousands of people. Clergy oversee funerals, work with people in poverty and other desperate circumstances, and they counsel the struggling, the sick, and the dying. This accumulates into something officially and euphemistically called compassion fatigue. It's also known more accurately as secondary traumatic stress or vicarious trauma. Despite the different terminologies at play here, the symptoms of compassion fatigue look a lot like PTSD. For instance, mood swings, pessimism and irritability, dramatic withdrawal from social connections, emotional disconnection, numbness, addiction, anxiety or depression, trouble being productive, insomnia, exhaustion, fatigue, changes in appetite, digestive issues, headaches. The only thing missing here is a symptom from the re-experiencing category of PTSD, and that just might be because the people involved here are trained not to talk about what they've experienced. Because there's also a lot of abuse that comes with being clergy or a hospital or military chaplain. Anyone angry at God yells at God's representative. But there's also an expectation that no matter what a member of the clergy endures, they're not allowed to get angry or even set boundaries, because that means they're bad at their job. How dare you? Therapists listening are going, yeah, I can relate to that. Yeah. And that's just not human for anyone. No profession, hobby, or calling takes away a person's need to feel their feelings, including that waitress you're yelling at. Yeah. Don't yell at the waitress, please. Yeah. And the idea that a person's job opens them up for abuse in any way is just not okay. Again, that goes for any job. The fact that we have to say this, but we do. Every medical clinic I walk in now has, verbal or other abuse will not be tolerated. In a doctor's office. Like, what? But due to religious trauma, clergy are a frequent target of people lashing out under understandable circumstances, and something can be a reason but not an excuse, right? Some people even make threats or get violent, which, again, is not okay, but it happens. And then there's the fact that every religion has things in it that, as individuals, we don't agree with. the statistic, I don't know if it's true, but this is a statistic, is that only 50% of priests actually remain celibate. If you're a pro-LGBTQ plus clergy in an anti-LGBTQ faith, that's some stress right there. When church dogma conflicts with best community practices, there can be a guilt and shame build up in the clergy. And then there's the staffing shortage. As of 2022, there was only one priest for ballpark here every 3,300 Catholics. So 3,300 Catholics for every priest. It's one priest to over 5,000 Catholics in Africa. Even in Europe, with the best ratio in the world, it's one priest to around 1,750 Catholics. That's a lot of people to be there for. Yeah. Not everybody goes to church, but let's just get off Christianity for a second, right? Weekly Friday prayers for American Muslims. Couldn't find the Canadian statistics, so I went with Americans. 410 people per mosque. That's as of 2020. The majority of Southern Baptist churches have Sunday service attendance of under 100 people, but consider that your average social worker averages around 26 cases at once, and that's considered high, especially when dealing with children. Yes, not every churchgoer needs personal attention, but you have to be prepared to do it. Being a member of the clergy is a difficult job for those who are conscientious. Now, why does this matter? Why am I talking about it now? Well, according to a survey by the Survey Center for American Life that came out a couple weeks ago now, but 10 days ago, belonging to a place of worship shows clear advantages when it comes to social supports, especially for people without college degrees. The starkest generational divide in religious membership is among Black people. And Black people without college degrees are the most likely to be lonely, with 35% saying they have no close friends. These are American statistics. I wish I had Canadian data, but the most recent stuff I could find isn't very detailed. What I could find is that 1 in 4 teenagers or young adults in Canada, so between the ages of 15 and 24, 1 in 4 report feeling always or often lonely. So religious institutions have a role to play, no matter how you feel about religious institutions. The people who rely the most, well, used to rely the most on church for social supports are the most lonely people by demographic out there. That's not fair to them. But, okay, let's address the elephant in the room, right? Religious institutions are letting a lot of people down. And that includes the people who work for them, the clergy. Which is why more people aren't becoming priests, rabbis, imams, right? We're going to dive into the perils facing specifically military chaplains with U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel Rebecca D'Angelo after the break on It's Not Therapy. Now, Rebecca's just a regular person. Well, okay, she's not a regular person. She's in the military, but you know what I mean. Do you have a story you think would be good for the show? Are you interested in sponsoring the show? NotTherapyShow.com is our website. You can join the mailing list, fill out the contact form while you're there. If you want to send me a direct email, Liana, Liana, that's N as in Nancy, Liana, at NotTherapyShow.com. Or, well, this is not a good way to reach out for guest stuff, but if you just want to give me a follow, you want to stay tuned into updates at Not Therapy Show on social media. I am back on TikTok. Oh, God. I haven't posted anything, but I made an account again. So I am back on TikTok. Pray for me. When we come back, PTSD in military chaplains. That was a terrible segue on It's Not Therapy. The following program is a peer-to-peer advice show and does not diagnose mental health conditions. If you're seeking social services, please call or text 211 or go to 211.ca. We're back and it's not therapy. I'm still Liana Kersner. I'm still not a therapist. It's time for the interview. And like I said before the break, I've got a very, very interesting guest. I love interviews with regular people dealing with mental health challenges. And this regular person, well, is not a civilian. I have Lieutenant Colonel Rebecca D'Angelo here. What branch of the military are you with, Rebecca, if you want to say?
I'm with the United States Army.
United States Army. Okay. And as per usual, whenever we have any military personnel here, Rebecca's opinions, statements do not reflect the military, but Rebecca is here to talk to us about her work helping and advocating for military chaplains with PTSD. Now, Rebecca, this is a really, really specific field. And the reason I'm interested in, there are a lot of competing headwinds, if you will. So briefly, how did you get into this?
So first off, thank you so much for the opportunity to discuss this topic with your listeners today. And I will share the story that got me started on this path. It's about serving in Charleston, and I had a gentleman who lived across the street from me who was a retired Air Force chaplain. Genuinely one of the sweetest, kindest people you will ever meet, like the type of elderly gentleman that small children and pets are drawn to. And we had actually served in Iraq together at the same time when he was a lieutenant colonel, and I was just a young officer, a lieutenant myself, on my first tour in Iraq in 2005. But he was sharing with me how he was struggling to get the VA to provide him with counseling services. And what he described that he was feeling as a chaplain was what he called having a wounded heart. Came from so much listening to the experiences of soldiers and airmen and Marines that he serviced, regardless of what branch they served in, and hearing their stories over and over and over again. And to see this sweet, kind man move to tears over his own frustrations, that his faith was not enough help him cope with this, inspired me to, one, help him with filing an amended claim with the VA, Veterans Affairs, for those of you outside of the United States, to request an additional assessment and also percentage of disability.
Right.
But what we've also found through his own, experience trying to get help is there's not actually a lot of services available for this specific type of PTSD. And so I'm trying to get the word out. Unfortunately, my current career, workload does not permit me to focus on this full time just yet.
Yeah. And
but if I get the word out, that helps.
Yeah. Now, getting the word out is important because there's an alarming lack of data regarding clergy with PTSD and the military, because, Veterans Affairs and everything is so documented and regimented because of this, disability system. It's some of the clearest data we get early with stuff like that. But among the general population, civilian population, it's as high as 35%. The amount of the clergy showing signs of PTSD like symptoms. Now, if that number holds, that's higher than first responders. So there's something really going on here. Now, let's see, if it's okay with you, how the civilian clergy corresponds with your experiences in the military regarding, do the people you work with talk about isolation or expectations of perfection because of what they do?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's we as officers, chaplains are military officers. We're looked at as leaders, regardless of what branch we are. I'm a logistics officer myself. But we're still leaders, and leaders are supposed to be strong,
Right.
supposed to be capable. And we look for that in our chaplains as well. And I think we were discussing earlier, before we started, about a visual that I try to compare this to, of like, imagine an empty trash can, and the pain and memories of the experience of others are balls of paper going into that trash can, and that chaplain is the trash can.
Hmm.
And eventually he's going to fill up and potentially overflow. So who's helping with that?
Hmm.
And so, it's a stigma, not just from being a military leader,
Hmm.
but also as a clergyman. To, your faith is supposed to be what you can lean on.
Right.
And when that's not enough, I think there is a great deal of shame and, frustration in themselves, that they literally cannot practice what they preach.
Yeah, and a commonly misunderstood element of PTSD is the fact that it's not just about being in a dangerous, life-threatening, or near-death experience. It is a profound sense of helplessness, that you do not have control over yourself and your destiny. And I imagine that crisis of faith coupled with listening is hard. I do listening for a living, and sometimes you just get certain things that chill you and leave you feeling like you should be able to do something, or in a better world you could do something. People shouldn't just be left to some of these mercies. And I imagine that, not to judge anyone's faith or judge faith itself, but that combination of, I feel helpless, there's injustices in the world that are injustices, combined with my faith is wrong and my faith is not enough. Is it something must be wrong with me that they end at, or is it more just something's wrong, there's nothing we can do?
I think it's both.
Mhm.
I know that in the instances, and speaking with not just my neighbor, but also my friends who are Army chaplains, um, they feel that they have failed,
Right.
and something wrong with them for not being able to compartmentalize these emotions and feelings and reactions. But it's also knowing that they need help, but may not be able to get it.
Right, because it's a who watches the watchman thing, right? Who counsels the counselors, who ministers to the clergy. It's got to be very difficult to find someone with the right combination of background and understanding and qualifications to treat this particular type of trauma.
Absolutely. And so far in the research that I've done, um, the Veterans Affairs Department doesn't really have those resources. And again, with any government organization, there's competition for fiscal resources
Right.
to conduct programs. And when you have such a small population, they oftentimes get drowned out with the needs of others. But that doesn't negate the need. And therefore, what is needed most is helpers helping helpers
Mhm.
through their voice, through requests for action, and assisting where they can as well.
No, I think there's also a lot of, I'll say ignorance very specifically, because it's not ill intent. It's just people don't know what they don't know. But hearing descriptions like this, you probably get a lot of people going, well, that's just bad feelings. That's not really PTSD. PTSD only happens to a certain type of person, right? And that's not true. This is fairly consistent with other types of, say, first responders that see a a lot of the worst parts of humanity, right? I mean, chaplains see people at their worst moments. There's a lot of death, there's a lot of loss, um, there's a lot of heartbreak. And are is the VA, you may not be able to talk about this, is the VA being decent in terms of the diagnosis, like acknowledging that this is real?
They're starting to.
Okay.
Um, but again, and just like you're not a therapist, I'm not a medical professional or a therapist myself. You know, it's need there's need for a better definition. PTSD with some sort of subset. And again, we came up with the phrase wounded heart,
Hmm.
but that's not a medical diagnosis. So it's a matter of finding the clinical terminology to meet the VA's requirements, but also ensuring that they are providing access to those providers who specialize in that type of care. And they are out there
Hmm.
because lots of state and local governments ensure that that is available for first responders, as you indicated. But we, the military, have not quite gotten on board at the federal level for that.
Right. So you're still trying to place some people with well, figuring out exactly what kind of care they need and then placing them with the correct kind of care.
Correct.
All right. I want to talk about what helps in a bit, but I want to continue to identify the problem because I do think there is a misunderstanding about this being a very, very real thing. I work with a lot of people as a peer counselor that don't seek help because they think people need it more than them, right? What they went through wasn't that bad. It isn't the stuff you see on TV. They didn't lose a leg in a war zone or something like that. And so they just feel like there's something defective or weak or wrong about them instead of recognizing that this is the brain working as intended. Something has to change. They deserve better. And you said that feeling of failure was something you'd seen, fairly significantly in the people you're helping and advocating for. What are some other symptoms that you're seeing as consistent with military chaplains with PTSD?
A profound sense of sadness.
Okay.
You know, the sadness of, the loss that they felt. I think clergymen, much in particular, I should say, are generally very empathic people.
Yes.
And when you are engaged as an empath, you can absorb the emotions of those around you. Well,
Mm-hmm.
imagine that over and over and over again from multiple sources. The loss of one or a few individuals within one organization that's supported by a chaplain affects everyone else in the unit to different degrees. And who's coming to the chaplain is a lot of people.
Right.
Not only does that individual have to, deal with the loss, but to feel the feelings of others, sometimes more than a few times. And it just becomes this cloud of sadness, that compounds with the feelings of failure. To feel like a failure and to feel this profound sadness just really takes some people into a dark place. Whether it's depression or nightmares or contributes to anxiety as well. It's definitely manifesting itself in multiple ways, and starts to affect them physically as well with the stress to the system all the time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's just a snowball effect, that has a resounding effect in that it's coming from so many different sources.
Yeah, civilian clergy, there's a lot of alcoholism that is sort of anecdotally talked about. Younger clergy, the people they came up through, a lot of them are, under the table alcoholics. And that's probably a cope. They probably didn't go in that way. It's a numbing, right? It's a self-medicating because going to help when you're supposed to be an ambassador of God, that's got to be really tough. Like there's got to be a lot of conflict.
Absolutely. Or when you go to get help, it's not what you need.
Right.
It's, to medicate is not necessarily the solution. And traditional PTSD talk therapy treatments, group therapy treatments may not scratch the itch.
Yeah.
It will to address their specific needs. But again, those needs require resources, funding, and availability. And there's just not a lot of that out there right now.
All right, you're anticipating where I want to go next, but let's take a break with Rebecca D'Angelo, Lieutenant Colonel, U.S. Army Logistics Officer, helping and advocating for chaplains with military PTSD. Rebecca, when we come back, we're going to talk about what works, what you found doesn't, and what holes we need to fill in the system. All right?
Sounds great.
Okay, stay tuned for that. Questions, comments, concerns, Liana at nottherapyshow.com. Nottherapyshow.com is the website. Fill out the contact form, join our mailing list there. Not Therapy Show on all social media. When we come back, PTSD and clergy in the military on It's Not Therapy. The following program is a peer-to-peer advice show and does not diagnose mental health conditions. If you're seeking social services, please call or text 211 or go to 211.ca. We're back in It's Not Therapy. I'm still Liana Kersner. I'm still not a therapist, and we are still talking to Lieutenant Colonel Rebecca D'Angelo of the U.S. military. Rebecca is it's just getting off the ground, helping and advocating for chaplains with military PTSD. And before the break, we talked about sort of what the issue is, how it's very, very real, and how the traditional methods of therapy for PTSD are not necessarily working with chaplains because of their role, but also because of the specific underlying causes and type of PTSD that they have. Now, Rebecca, what stuff isn't working? Like you said, group therapy doesn't work, obviously, because, it's tough to be in a group when you're a clergy. But what other stuff is not working? The standard kind of talk therapy?
I think it varies from individual to individual, of course. Some methods of therapy may be more effective than others. But the coping mechanisms that are typically being taught through PTSD therapy are geared towards, helping to compartmentalize and adapt to individual instances that affected that person.
Yeah, it's based on functionality.
Right. Not necessarily a multitude of experiences, varied experiences, excessive amounts of experiences because of the number of people you may or may not have been ministering to. And so it's just much more complex than that. And so what is needed is therapists who can help them with that management of those emotions, because in more than anything, just acknowledge the difference in the type of PTSD as opposed to more traditional PTSD.
Yeah, that kind of confounds the existing definitions because you're describing a form of complex PTSD, which is not a recognized billing code right now. It's developmental trauma, which only happens in childhood. So yeah, this is one of these things, as well as the moral injury phenomenon that we're seeing coming out of the military as well. It's not quite traditional PTSD. Moral injury is more being afraid of what they could do to the world because at some point they were forced to go against their values. This sounds like it's like an empathy overload or a state of persistent overwhelm. They just took on so much that it got stuck. And that getting stuck is well familiar to anybody with PTSD. So what does help? Because I imagine that a combination of therapy, but also a supportive community outside of therapy would be very, very useful to someone in this situation.
I agree. And, but where do those get formed?
Right.
Is this something the VA should be taking on, which my opinion is yes. But in the absence of that, where can we establish groups to help with that? Where can we bring the resources in until such a point that the VA is able to support it itself if they get there? Again, we're dealing with such a small population that they tend to get overwhelmed with the needs of others for different things. And chaplains being chaplains, they're going to put others before themselves.
Yeah, and I imagine they're caught between, one of the big problem with anybody in the military reintegrating into civilian life is a lack of understanding of what a soldier does. But also, you have that pacifism that's part of a lot of faiths clashing with the military identity. I imagine it's very hard for them to find community. Have you found that?
So they do tend to be somewhat isolated.
Yeah.
Chaplains are specific to the Army. They're never below the battalion level. So that can be anywhere between 300 to 1,000 troops. And you have
Yeah.
one person who's responsible for quite a flock, regardless of what denomination they are. We have Christian chaplains, we have Muslim chaplains, we have Hindu chaplains,
Hmm.
representing various faiths. And they have a large group that they're responsible for. And we also, the chaplain corps struggles to even recruit.
Yeah.
Um, we have a shortage across the Army, across all branches of the service, of people who are, one, willing to put on a uniform in the service of their faith to others, but also meeting the physical requirements
Right.
to be able to go into a combat zone. So it's a huge undertaking for any of these people who follow that calling.
Yeah, and I mean that kind of overwhelm that hits you on a nervous system level. Like just you don't know how to wind down anymore. That's a huge number of people, and I imagine multiple people will be coming to the same chaplain about the same event, and keeping confidentiality must be incredibly difficult.
It's still part of it. It's so much a part of who they are,
Yeah.
though. But then to keep all of that inside, going back to our
Right.
about the trash can, it if you don't take the trash out, it overflows. It can, it can start to fester into what's happening for these gentlemen and ladies. Although I specifically have not met any female chaplains
Right.
um, yet, but it's still an overflowing, overwhelming, words that we are seeing over and over again, to describe it. But the actions against that are just not being taken by the VA at this time. Um, Again, in my opinion,
Hmm.
uh, because again, strained resources, strained capabilities. It's still going to take some time to get that out there.
Yeah, and I imagine beginning to open up talking about any of it, it's going to feel like a betrayal at first because that secrecy, that confidentiality on so many levels is ingrained in them. That's got to be a hard thing to unlearn. Have you seen any of that?
I haven't seen it unlearned yet.
Ah,
What I
okay.
see first is just the, trying to get to the acknowledgement that it's okay, because I when we were talking about earlier, that sense of failure, that sense of frustration, the common phrase that I've heard in the individuals I've worked with so far, trying to help them with their revised VA claims, is I, you know, I failed. Um,
Mhm.
I failed as a chaplain. I failed as a servant of God. I failed as a servant um, to whomever, whatever religious, background they have. Um, and so it's just getting them to accept that that's okay. They need help and understanding that that's okay, and they can still get help. They're not
Right.
held to a higher standard other than themselves, that they are the ones limiting themselves in that.
Now, are there specifics regarding this sense of failure? Is it, the faith in God wasn't strong enough, they failed to effectively minister, or is it just sort of this general feeling that they let everybody down?
I think it's all three.
Okay.
Especially that they have not necessarily that they failed to minister, um, unless it has to do with suicides. When
Right.
sensitive to, loss of soldiers through suicide, because a lot of times they are almost questioned. What were you doing to help prevent this? And if the
Yeah.
soldier had never come to them in the first place and they didn't know, there's still that blame that they can place on themselves, and that contributes to the feeling of the stress, the PTSD,
Yeah.
in addition to their own feelings as a personal failure for not being able to rely on their faith to get them through the darkness.
Yeah, I imagine because a lot of therapists who don't have specific training uh in dealing with people with suicidal ideation, they just won't see the client. I imagine a military chaplain doesn't have that luxury. They don't have that freedom. They kind of have to do their best. Am I right there?
Absolutely. Anytime that a suicidal ideation is reported, um, through the chain of command, the chaplains are one of the first ones called in, to see the soldier and to interact with them, and to try to get to the root cause of, the ideation itself. But they're that first conduit of treatment and entry into the behavioral health system, especially in a combat zone where resources would be limited.
Yeah. And I mean the military suicides are such a big issue. I don't know of anybody that those affect an entire community. It's not just the family, it's everybody who served feels. I think everybody feels that failure, like there's something they could have done or they wish they'd known. It's a very difficult thing to work through. The sheer number that a military chaplain has to grapple with it sounds inconceivable.
Oh, it's inconceivable, but also admirable to watch.
Hmm.
Um, you know, in my background in logistics, our units tend to be extremely large.
Hmm.
Have a young captain, oftentimes freshly into the military as a chaplain, who now has a huge flock, a diverse flock. It's not like going to the church where you're the minister and everyone there is belongs to your faith. You have so much diversity
Hmm.
to adhere to and to assist with. Because if you are the only one there, you have to be able to provide that comfort, provide that reassurance to someone, regardless of their faith.
Hmm. Now, with civilian clergy, one of the things they do is they give clergy training. Pastors' wives, like clergymen's wives, get or partners get training as well. And that's what we bring to the community thing because we can't, the VA is going to move the way the VA is going to move, right? What can people around, not just not just chaplains, but any sort of supporting officers. There's a whole thing in America right now of whether someone's in the military, if they weren't in a war zone, it doesn't count, right? Is that damaging? Because if you served, you served. And there are things people need to know. What are those things people need to know? I know that was a compound question. Pick the start wherever you want.
Sure. So service is stressful.
Yeah.
Combat is a different ball game. Combat is
Mhm.
combat, but service is stressful in and of itself. We have a phrase called the operational tempo, the op tempo. That has not slowed down, and we are still away from our families,
Yeah.
uh, training. Um, we are still, the Army in particular is still deploying to Europe, to Korea on rotational basis.
Hmm.
So whether you're seeing combat or not, you may not necessarily be home with your support structure in a organic way. You're away from your wife, you're away from your friends, you're away from your parents.
Yep.
Um, and so that is its own stress. And the same thing goes, for the chaplains. They are also away from their families. They
Yep.
are also away from their friends, and a lot of times they're away from their network of religious providers who would be local to them otherwise.
Hmm.
So it's very isolating. And so I I kind of cringe at the notion that, just because you didn't serve in combat, it negates the service and sacrifice that anyone made, because
Exactly.
if it was easy, everyone would do it.
Yeah. I mean, the idea, people don't realize what that's like. It's like you're ripped away from everything. And then you have to reintegrate. And the reintegration period has gotten shorter and shorter and shorter since I started covering this stuff, right? It went from 6 months to 3 months. I don't even know if it's that anymore. So what can people do? What would you like people to understand about this issue and things connected to it? What can community do?
Community can first acknowledge that something is different with this. And I think there's a lot of folks who would just appreciate the acknowledgement that it's something different. Then actions can be taken, whether it's soliciting members of Congress who may be on relevant committees, such as the Armed Services Committee or the Veterans Affairs committees, to ask them to start resourcing this. Because at the end of the day, it boils down to appropriations. If there's funding for programs, that has to be the first start. Uh,
Hmm.
So talking to community leaders, um, seeing what can be done within state and local governments to, help build those grassroots programs. Um, Making sure that people understand the access channels to get those care.
Mm-hmm.
Services offices in your county, in your state, here in the United States, knowing who those people are and what they can do for you. And of course, veteran services organizations, for example, the Wounded Warrior Foundation, who I'm not affiliated with, but also does try to provide those resources. Um, it's just finding the path, because again, you're
Mm-hmm.
dealing with people overwhelmed already. It's not necessarily, intuitive to try to get them to help them help themselves. So it's important for us to try to help them find their way.
Yeah, the intake process is kind of dehumanizing. That was me putting it lightly. It's for an already overwhelmed person, the sheer amount of questions, the sheer number of people you have to call. It's a lot. It causes a lot of people to shut down. It's just too much. So, if you've got someone in your family, I think it also makes the people around them feel helpless. Yeah, Rebecca, that they see them suffering. They don't know what to do. They don't think they can do anything. It's almost like a contagion, a domino effect.
Oh, it absolutely is. Going back to the example of my neighbor who was my
Yeah,
initial into this, his wife, she's a preacher's wife, and she knows and expects to be strong and supportive for her husband, but she can't relate to this in any way
right.
because she didn't experience it. So she also, experienced some feelings of helplessness and sadness and frustration to see her, her husband, her partner in life suffering, and there was nothing she could do to help him.
Hmm. Lieutenant Colonel Rebecca D'Angelo, everyone, U.S. Army. Rebecca, thanks so much for coming on to talk about this, very, very new developing area of mental health that's both daunting and exciting. Thanks so much for your time and your candor.
Anytime, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to share.
When we come back, final thoughts on how you can help in community. Questions, comments, any feedback. Do you have a story that you think would be good for the show? Liana at nottherapyshow.com. Nottherapyshow.com is the website. Fill out the contact form. Join the mailing list while you're there, or social media at Not Therapy Show. I have rejoined TikTok. Oh, God. When we come back, final thoughts. The following program is a peer-to-peer advice show and does not diagnose mental health conditions. If you're seeking social services, please call or text 211 or go to 211.ca. We're back in It's Not Therapy. I'm still Liana Kersner. I'm still not a therapist, and we're in our final segment about this episode about chaplains, clergy, PTSD, and compassion fatigue, whatever you want to call it. I'm not big on labels. Everybody's got something. That's why we distinguish between good crazy and bad crazy. And I wanted to extrapolate on what Rebecca was saying about how regular people can help. Because for some people, the idea of contacting a congressperson or a member of parliament or an advocacy group can be daunting. If this sounds like you, well, do it anyway. However, back in the day when I was living in a different place, I wrote my MP advocating for stronger cyberbullying legislation in Canada, got a letter that said, well, making law is hard. And then I got put on a Conservative Party donor mailing list. So, if this isn't the right option for you, I completely understand. So if it's not the right option for you, what do? Right? There are some really powerful, simple phrases you can ask anybody in your life, because everybody's struggling somehow. Some people are struggling a little. Some people are struggling a lot. Some people are almost at their breaking point, but for everyone, the struggle is real. Nobody has it all together, including those people you think are perfection incarnate, or people from a higher power, like that very, very wealthy friend, or your local clergy, or somebody who just seems to never be upset. Everybody's got something, trust me. So, okay, super powerful phrase. Are you ready? The phrase is, are you okay? Are you okay? And then the important thing is, really listen. Because there's a difference between yeah and yeah, I guess, right? Really listen. Don't ask things like that if you're not prepared to hear both yes and no. And the follow-up, if somebody is not okay, real simple. What do you need? The majority of the time, someone will just say, just talking helps. Just knowing that somebody cares helps. They may say, I need a ride to the doctor. They may say, I'm short on money this month. I could use a meal. These are all things that Survey on American Life indicated people with no close friends suffer from. Something like a ride, something like a hand, cat sitting, maybe, not if you're allergic to cats. Just do what you can, right? Everybody has a part to play. Listen twice before you talk once. Top 10 phrase. A lot of people say to me, I don't do that because I don't know what to say and I don't want to say the wrong thing. You don't have to know what to say. Something as simple as, I can't imagine what that's like. What do you need is enough, right? People like Rebecca find these sorts of purpose. What's a plural of purpose? Purpose. People like Rebecca find these purposes because they listen effectively. They don't just wait for their chance to talk. Asking questions is better than making assumptions. And at first I thought that should be one of the top 10 phrases, but I realized that's a subset of don't let problems that aren't your fault lead to mistakes that are. You may not know what to do with someone who's struggling, but everybody has that compassion fatigue, and I find what extends my ability to be compassionate is to ask questions instead of make assumptions. I didn't cause it, I can't cure it, but I can listen. I can be there and give a truly supportive word like, well, I like the world better with you in it than if you weren't in the world. Sometimes that's all a person needs to hear, especially when they're suffering from a trauma condition. But I am out of time. Questions, comments, concerns. NotTherapyShow.com is your one-stop shop for everything. I have to update it. I realize something is way out of date there. But anyway, I'm also out of time. You're crazy is only a problem if it's hurting you. See you next time.